Hi everyone. This is the first of two PowerPoints that will examine a couple aspects of the American home front experience during World War II. First, we'll look at racism in the war, and then we'll look at what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II and connect that actually with the theme of racism in the Pacific War as well. So let's jump into this. I really emphasized in class the importance of you understanding that the American experience in World War II is unique in comparison to every other major participant in the war. I mentioned how the Soviet Union suffered losses now estimated at 27 million to 30 million people, soldiers and civilians. That's a scale just incomprehensible to Americans. And we're the only major participating nation that's not bombed, that's not invaded. And this is going to impact how Americans approach the post-war world. They just have a different set of expectations and really a different outlook from people elsewhere. And we're not covering in class what happens with American women during the war, although I want to use that as a springboard to talk about racism. But pay attention to what Eric Foner has to say about that. Millions of women entered the workforce and served in branches of the military, frequently doing jobs that previously had only been held by men, and always paid less than men were. Black women paid less than white women too, but the contributions of women were recognized and celebrated through this character, Rosie the Riveter. And you've probably seen this image that became one of the iconic images of the war and still used in memes, and I've seen it on greeting cards. Rosie the Riveter was celebrated even in a popular song at the time. And the fact that this was a white woman, again, speaks to prevailing depictions in popular culture and in the media that we talked about when we looked at the 1920s, how what the media presents, and largely you see this through popular culture too, is very much a white world. And that's going to be the springboard for talking about racism and the war. World War II is really the foundation of the modern civil rights movement, and we'll start exploring the emergence of the civil rights movement in the 1950s, starting week 5. So in contrast to that Rosie the Riveter image, the contributions of women of color, particularly Black women, Hispanic women, just weren't recognized to the same degree. You don't see posters acknowledging their contributions. This is one of my favorite wartime photographs of a young Black woman working as a welder in a shipyard in California. And there's a look of kind of hopeful expectation here that I find very powerful. But again, this sort of imagery doesn't make it into popular consciousness during the war to the same degree like you see with the Rosie the Riveter depiction. Racism was a huge part of American culture, obviously, still during World War II. For me, as a historian, understanding the history of systemic racism in the United States is really fundamental to knowing American history, understanding our country and your place in it even today. And racism became an issue during the war, and there was heightened awareness of it. And I mentioned in class, this is mainly because the United States is part of a coalition fighting one of the most racist regimes in world history, Nazi Germany. Nazi ideology was completely based on racism. That's at the very core of what Nazism was about. And at the time Pearl Harbor was attacked, as I note on this slide, Black Americans weren't allowed to serve in the Marine Corps or the Army Air Corps. Now that changes for the Army Air Corps during the war with the training initially of a group known as the Tuskegee Airmen and training of the first Black pilots. The Navy only allowed Black Americans to serve initially as custodians and cooks, and the only branch of the armed forces that historically had accepted Black Americans for service was the U.S. Army, but that was always within segregated units, always under the command of white officers, and that didn't change during World War II. This wouldn't change until Harry Truman issued an executive order integrating the armed forces a couple years after the end of the Second World War. And this went as far as the Army segregating blood plasma during the war. And I mentioned in class the irony of that is that really the transfusion process, one of the key people developing that was a Black doctor named Charles Drew. So these are the lengths to which this was carried out, this idea that you couldn't have, blood from a Black person used in a transfusion for a white soldier. So among Black Americans, there was a strong sense that developed during the war that things had to change in the post-war period. And this was articulated in an editorial by the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the leading Black newspapers of the era. Early in 1942, ran a very influential editorial that was reprinted in other Black magazines and newspapers calling for a double V campaign, meaning victory against America's enemies abroad, but also victory against racism and discrimination here in the United States. This was widely discussed within the Black community. Black ministers talked about it from pulpits. They said this was republished and discussed in Black publications across the country. The first sit-in protests against public segregation happened during the Second World War, and those are going to be revived. That concept is revived in the early 1960s by Black college students as part of the civil rights movement then. So Black Americans, well remembered that they had enlisted in large numbers during World War I with the hope that service to their country would help improve attitudes here in the United States. And instead, we got one of the most racist decades in American history in the 1920s. The Tulsa Race Massacre, the worst example of that in American history, happening in 1921. So there's this strong sense that things have to change in the post-war period this time. And I mentioned in class, this is just one of dozens and dozens of examples similar to this that we could talk about. But one that I've always found resonates very much with me happened in Salina, Kansas in 1943, when a group of Black soldiers tried to enter a restaurant in downtown Salina, here in the middle of the heartland of America, and the owner turned them away, saying it was whites only. And this group of Black soldiers was surprised, angry about this, but even more outraged when they looked inside and realized that eating their dinner in the restaurant was a group of German POWs, prisoners of war, because there was a Nazi POW camp near Salina. So I want you to think about this, the reality of America during World War II. Here we are as part of this coalition of allied nations fighting to defeat one of the most racist regimes in world history, Nazi Germany, and yet Black American soldiers can't enter a restaurant in their own country where Nazi prisoners of war are enjoying a meal. Absolutely outrageous. And this is exactly the type of thing that captured for many Black Americans what had to change in the post-war period. And we watched in class, and I'm going to post this on our Canvas page too, a clip from Spike Lee's film Miracle at St. Anna, which was one of the first mainstream Hollywood films to explore the experience of black soldiers in the Second World Wars. He follows, in this particular movie, a group of black soldiers who were fighting in Italy. And it has a scene that we watched where two of the sergeants that you see here have an argument about the meaning of the war, different perspectives on it. And in the course of that argument, they flash back to an incident that happened to them in Louisiana where they were in basic training. Spike Lee based the scene on this film on this incident that I just told you about happening in Kansas, only he transposes it to Louisiana and gives it a different twist and a different outcome, you'll see, than what happened in real life. But it's a powerful sequence that speaks to these themes I've been talking about and what Black Americans were discussing during the war. So again, racism, understanding that key aspect of understanding the American experience during the war. And as I said, World War II really serves as the foundation of the modern civil rights movement that we're going to be talking about repeatedly in the weeks ahead in our class.